Let me start with a number. One drone. Total cost, according to open source estimates on Iranian loitering munitions, somewhere between $2,000 and $20,000. Pause. That's it. That's the whole budget. Now hold that number in your head because I'm going to give you a second number and I want you to sit with the gap between them. $2 billion. That is a rough public estimate of what a single layer of modern air and missile defense, radar, command nodes, interceptors, the crews who run it, costs to field and sustain over its operational life in a contested region. $2 billion give or take, depending on which system you're pricing out, okay? So somewhere in the last several days, according to defense analysts tracking activity in the Gulf, a single low-cost Iranian drone did something that a $2 billion defense architecture was built specifically to prevent. And I want to be very precise about what I'm claiming and what I'm not claiming, because this is where most channels get sloppy, and I refuse to be sloppy with you. I am not telling you a specific base was destroyed. I am not telling you people died. What I am telling you is that a single low-cost platform reportedly penetrated, confused, or bypassed a defense system that cost thousands of times more than the thing attacking it. And if that's true, even partially true, it tells you something about the next 20 years of warfare that almost nobody in mainstream defense media wants to say out loud because it's bad for business. Are you ready? Let's go. The official story. Here's what a senior U.S. defense official reportedly told a small press pool earlier this week, paraphrasing the standard talking points you'll recognize if you follow this channel. The incident was minor, the system performed as designed, and no operational capability was compromised. Sounds reassuring, doesn't it? A system performing as designed is the kind of phrase that's built to end a conversation, not start one. Regional wire services carrying the story used almost identical language. Isolated incident, under review, no impact to readiness. 3 phrases, repeated across 5 outlets, all sourced back to the same unnamed briefing. When you see that pattern, 1 source, 5 headlines, 0 independent verification, that should make you pause. Not because it's necessarily false, because it's unfalsifiable in its current form, and unfalsifiable claims are exactly the kind of claims you should slow down on. Cable panels ran with it anyway. One side used the story to argue American deterrence is eroding in real time. The other side used the same story to argue the system caught the threat, and the incident proves resilience, not weakness. Same set of facts, 2 completely opposite conclusions, and nobody on either panel asked the one question that actually matters here. Why both sides are asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, did the defense system work or not? That's a binary, and binaries make for good television, but they make for bad analysis. The right question, the one I want you to carry through the rest of this video, is this. What does it cost the defender to stop a threat versus what does it cost the attacker to create one? That ratio is called cost-imposition, and once you understand it, you will never watch a defense system headline the same way again. Cost-imposition is not a new idea. Militaries have studied it since at least the Cold War, when the Soviet Union tried to bankrupt NATO through sheer volume of cheap armor, and NATO tried to counter it with expensive precision instead. But something changed in the last decade, and I don't think enough people have clocked it yet. Drones flipped the ratio. For most of military history, the expensive side was the attacker. Bombers, missiles, aircraft carriers. Defense was comparatively cheap. Now for the first time in a long time, the attacker can be the cheap side, and the defender is stuck holding the expensive bag. Think about what that means structurally. A country with almost no air force, a fraction of the GDP, and a fraction of the technological base can still impose real costs on a superpower. Not by matching its firepower, but by exploiting the price gap. You don't need to beat America's military. You need to make defending against you more expensive than attacking you over and over until the math breaks someone's budget. I'm going to call this the Overmatch Illusion, and I want you to remember that name because we're coming back to it at the end. The timeline, as best as it can be reconstructed. Let's lay out what's publicly known, in order, without the spin. Reports began circulating mid-week that a small unmanned aerial system, likely a modified commercial or quasi-military airframe, crossed into airspace monitored by a layered U.S. or Allied defense network in the Gulf region. Radar and intercept assets in the area are understood to include a mix of Patriot batteries, shorter-range counter-rocket artillery mortar systems, and naval assets equipped with their own point defense weapons. This is, on paper, one of the densest defensive umbrellas on the planet. According to open source flight tracking chatter and regional analyst commentary, the drone was detected. That part appears consistent across sources. What's disputed is what happened next. One version says it was engaged and destroyed well outside any sensitive perimeter, a clean intercept, textbook performance. A second version, circulating through defense-focused social accounts with apparent knowledge of the incident, suggests the drone either evaded initial engagement, exploited a low-altitude radar gap, or forced defenders to expend a disproportionately expensive interceptor on a target that cost a fraction of a percent of the interceptor's price. Here's the detail that made me sit up. If the second version is even partially accurate, if a single interceptor priced in the low millions of dollars was fired at a drone worth a few thousand die, that exchange ratio alone should be the headline, not whether the system worked. Whether the system can financially survive working repeatedly against an adversary who can build these things faster than interceptors can be manufactured and shipped. There's also a third possibility that almost nobody covering this story has raised, and I think it deserves at least as much attention as the other two. Some regional defense commentators have floated the idea that the drone in question may never have been intended to strike anything at all. In that reading, the entire purpose of the flight was to be detected, to force a response, and to generate exactly the kind of ambiguous, dual narrative headline we got. If that's accurate, then arguing about whether the intercept worked completely misses the point of the exercise. A probe doesn't need to hit a target to succeed. It only needs to make the defender reveal how, when, and at what cost it responds. Militaries have used cheap probing assets for exactly this purpose for as long as air defense has existed, and a single low-cost drone is a remarkably efficient way to run that kind of test without risking anything of real value. The blind spot nobody wants to name. So what is the actual $2 billion blind spot? It's not a hole in the radar coverage, not literally. Modern layered defense systems are extremely good at detecting things. The blind spot is economic, and economic blind spots are much harder to fix than technical ones, because you can't patch a budget with a software update. Layer 1 of the blind spot, production asymmetry. Precision interceptors take months to build, require specialized components, and are constrained by defense industrial supply chains that were never designed for the volume this threat environment now demands. Cheap drones can be assembled from commercial parts in distributed workshops at a pace that dwarfs interceptor manufacturing. When the attacker's production curve is steeper than the defender's, time is not on the defender's side, no matter how good any single intercept looks on a given day. Layer 2. The doctrine gap. Air defense doctrine across most Western militaries was built primarily around high-value, high-speed threats. Fighter jets, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. Every one of those threats justifies an expensive interceptor because the thing you're stopping is itself expensive and dangerous in a way that matches the cost. Slow, cheap, low-flying drones don't fit that doctrine cleanly. Using a multi-million-dollar interceptor on a several thousand-dollar drone isn't a technical failure. It's a doctrine built for yesterday's threat being forced to answer today's, and paying full price every single time it does. Layer 3, and this is the one that should actually worry you. The psychological layer. A defense system doesn't just have to work. It has to be perceived to work cheaply enough and reliably enough that political leadership doesn't start asking whether the whole architecture is sustainable. The moment credible reporting suggests a single low-cost drone can force an expensive response, or worse, can occasionally slip through, you get a slow bleed of confidence that spreads through budget hearings, allied procurement decisions, and insurance markets for commercial shipping in the region. None of that shows up on a radar screen. All of it shows up eventually in a defense budget. A pattern with a precedent. None of this is actually unprecedented, and understanding the precedent is what separates a real forecast from a hot take. Historians who study asymmetric conflict have a name for this pattern, and it goes back further than drones, further than missiles, further than air power entirely. Consider the rocket-propelled grenade against the armored vehicle. For most of the 20th century, armor was the dominant, expensive answer to infantry threats. A main battle tank could cost, in modern terms, well into 8 figures. An RPG round, depending on variant, could cost a few $100s. Nobody claimed an RPG could defeat a tank in a fair fight, and it couldn't. But a well-placed RPG could disable a tank, force a costly repair or total loss, and more importantly, force the side fielding tanks to rethink whether armor alone was worth the investment in certain environments. That single insight reshaped urban warfare doctrine for decades. Consider naval mines against battleships. A mine costing a fraction of a percent of a warship's value could sink or cripple that warship, and navies spent enormous sums developing minesweeping capability specifically because the cost imposition math was so lopsided that ignoring it was not an option. Nobody called minesweeping an overreaction. They called it a rational response to an asymmetric threat because the alternative was losing capital ships to $5 problems. Consider improvised explosive devices against armored convoys in more recent conflicts. Devices built from commercial components and artillery scrap, costing at most a few $100s, forced sustained multi-billion-dollar investment in route clearance technology, jamming systems, and vehicle redesign. The vehicles that resulted, the MRAP family among them, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each, purpose-built to survive threats that individually cost almost nothing to construct. Every single one of these historical cases follows the identical shape. A cheap, distributed threat forces an expensive, centralized response. The expensive side almost always technically wins each individual engagement in the narrow sense that the specific attack is defeated or the specific vehicle survives, and the expensive side almost always loses the broader economic contest over the following decade because the production and cost curves never favor the side paying full price for every single engagement. If the reporting on this drone incident holds up even loosely, it fits neatly inside that historical shape, not as something new, but as the newest chapter of an old and remarkably consistent pattern. What Iran actually demonstrated, if the reports hold up. I want to be careful here, because demonstrated is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I don't want to overclaim. If the core reporting is accurate, even loosely, what's been shown is not that Iran can defeat American air defense. It clearly cannot, not in a sustained, symmetric conflict, and nobody serious argues otherwise. What's been shown, potentially, is narrower and in some ways more unsettling, that a single low-cost platform can force a disproportionately expensive response, can create uncertainty about detection reliability at certain altitudes or approach vectors, and can generate a media and political effect completely out of proportion to its own material cost. That's not a battlefield victory. That's a cost imposition victory. And those two things are not the same category of win. A battlefield victory changes territory. A cost imposition victory changes budgets, changes procurement priorities, changes how allies calculate risk the next time they're asked to host expensive American assets. Quietly, without a single headline calling it a defeat, cost imposition victories accumulate, and accumulation is exactly how a smaller power erodes a larger one over years, not days. Regional defense analysts have been flagging this pattern for a while, not specifically about this incident, but about the broader trend. Cheap drone proliferation across non-state and smaller state actors has been outpacing the doctrinal and budgetary response of larger militaries for several years now. This incident, if the reporting holds, is a data point in a curve that was already bending in this direction. It's not the start of the story. It might be one of the more visible chapters. The counterargument, Steelmanned. Let me give the other side its strongest version because I promised you at the start of this channel that I'd do that honestly, and I meant it. The strongest counterargument goes like this. Even if the exchange ratio looks bad on paper, the system did its job because its job is to prevent damage, not to be cost efficient. A $2 million interceptor that saves a facility, a ship, or lives is worth every penny, regardless of what it costs the attacker to force that trade. Cost imposition analysis, in this view, is an accounting exercise that ignores the actual mission, which is protection, not profit and loss. That argument has real force, and I don't want to wave it away. Protecting assets and personnel is the actual point of a defense system, and a favorable news cycle for the attacker doesn't mean anyone actually lost anything of material value. If nothing was damaged and nobody was hurt, calling this a blind spot might be overselling a routine intercept as a strategic crisis. Here's my honest response to that counterargument. It's correct in isolation and wrong at scale. One expensive intercept against one cheap drone is a rounding error. 1,000 of them, sustained over years, against an adversary who can manufacture cheap drones faster than interceptors can be replaced, is not a rounding error. It's a structural problem, and structural problems don't announce themselves with one dramatic headline. They show up as slowly shrinking interceptor stockpiles, slowly rising insurance premiums for shipping through contested waters, and slowly declining political appetite for maintaining forward defense commitments that keep costing money without a clean, visible payoff. The counterargument wins the single event. The cost-imposition framework wins the trend line, and trend lines are what actually decide who's ahead in 10 years. Back to the Overmatch Illusion. Remember the name I asked you to hold on to. The Overmatch Illusion is the belief that because one side has overwhelming qualitative superiority, better technology, better training, vastly larger budgets, that side automatically wins any prolonged contest with a smaller adversary. It's an illusion, not because the qualitative gap isn't real, it obviously is real. It's an illusion because wars of attrition, including slow economic and reputational wars of attrition, are not won by whoever has the better weapon on a given day. They're won by whoever can sustain the exchange rate longer. Iran cannot outbuild the United States military. Nobody serious argues that. But Iran does not need to outbuild the United States military to win a cost-imposition contest. It needs only to make every individual defensive success expensive enough and frequent enough that the aggregate cost eventually forces a change in posture, doctrine, or political will. That's a completely different kind of victory condition than the one most cable news coverage is built to explain, because it doesn't resolve in a single news cycle. It resolves over years in budget line items nobody watches on television. This is, by the way, not a new insight in military history, even if the specific technology is new. Insurgencies and smaller powers have used cost-imposition logic for centuries, forcing larger powers to spend disproportionately on defense, garrison, and occupation relative to what the smaller power spends on resistance. What's changed is the speed and the price point. A tactic that used to require years of guerrilla campaigning can now be approximated in narrow form by a workshop-built drone worth less than a used car. 3 things to actually watch. Next, I'm not going to end this video by telling you what to think. I'm going to give you 3 concrete things to track over the coming weeks so you can evaluate this framework against reality instead of just taking my word for it. First, watch interceptor procurement announcements. If defense budgets in the region start shifting meaningfully toward cheaper counter-drone systems, directed energy, electronic warfare, lower-cost kinetic interceptors, that's a tacit admission that the cost-imposition problem is real and being taken seriously at the planning level, regardless of what any official spokesperson says publicly. Second, watch insurance and shipping data for the relevant maritime corridors. Insurers price risk based on actual incident data, not press releases. If premiums for vessels transiting the region tick upward in the coming months, that's an independent signal, outside the control of any government's messaging, that the underlying risk calculus has shifted. Third, and this is the one most people miss, watch what allied nations do with their own procurement requests, not what Washington says. Allies who are asked to host or co-fund expensive layered defense assets will quietly recalculate their own contributions if they start believing the cost-imposition trend is real. That recalculation almost never gets announced directly. It shows up as delayed contracts, reduced troop hosting commitments, or diversification toward cheaper indigenous systems instead of expensive imported ones. There's a fourth signal, quieter than the other 3, and it's the one I personally weight the heaviest. Watch defense contractor earnings calls. Publicly traded companies that manufacture interceptor systems are legally required to give investors forward guidance on production capacity and order backlogs. If you see language shifting toward surge capacity constraints or extended lead times for counter-drone systems specifically, that's not political spin. That's a company telling shareholders, under securities law, what its actual production reality looks like. Executives don't inflate manufacturing bottlenecks to please investors. If the bottleneck shows up there, it's real. The question cable news never asks. Before we get to your homework, I want to name the specific failure mode I think mainstream coverage keeps falling into, because once you see it, you'll notice it in almost every defense story you read from now on. Cable coverage treats every intercept as a discrete event, graded pass or fail, like a single exam. Cost-imposition thinking treats every intercept as one data point in a running average, where what matters isn't today's grade, it's the trend across the whole semester. A student who fails one quiz isn't failing the class. A student who fails the same type of quiz every single week for a year is failing the class, even if nobody points to any one quiz and calls it the moment everything fell apart. Defense budgets work exactly the same way. No single incident sinks a $2 billion architecture. 100 similar incidents, each individually dismissed as minor, absolutely can. That is precisely why the isolated incident framing you heard from officials at the top of this video isn't necessarily dishonest, but it is, by design, the wrong unit of analysis. Of course it's isolated. Every single data point in a trend line is, by definition, isolated when you look at it alone. The question was never whether this one drone mattered in isolation. The question is, what happens when you stop looking at incidents one at a time and start looking at the curve they're drawing together? Your homework. Here's what I want you to actually do, not just nod along and move to the next video. Go find the public unit cost figures for the interceptor systems most commonly deployed in Gulf air defense architecture. They're not classified. Congressional Research Service reports and defense budget documents publish rough per-unit costs regularly. Then find any public estimate of low-cost drone production costs from open-source defense journals. Put the two numbers side by side. Divide one by the other. That ratio is the actual story, far more than any headline about whether an individual intercept succeeded or failed. If you do that homework and the ratio doesn't concern you, genuinely, come argue with me in the comments. Tell me why the exchange rate doesn't matter, or why I'm wrong about the trend. I want that pushback. The only way this analysis gets better is if people who disagree bring better evidence than I have, not just louder opinions. The question I want you to sit with. So here's where I want to leave you. Not with a conclusion, because I don't think we have enough confirmed detail yet to draw a hard conclusion about this specific incident. I want to leave you with the question underneath it. If a single drone, worth less than most people's monthly rent, can force a response worth thousands of times its own price, and if that exchange can be repeated indefinitely by an adversary with far less to lose than the defender, then who is actually winning this contest? Is it the side with the more expensive system, or is it the side that can afford to keep losing cheap drones forever? Because a $2 billion defense architecture doesn't fail the day it gets breached. It fails the day it becomes too expensive to keep operating the way it was designed to operate. And nobody ever puts that particular failure on the evening news. I'll see you in the next one.